Hello, Gothamites. You are listening to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. My name is Brian Ward. With me, as always, the psychologist to the superheroines, superheroes, supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Andrea Letamendi. Hello, Andrea.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to be back. You and I need to discuss a little bit. The last episode we did was our live episode from San Diego Comic Fest. But we didn't get an opportunity to really talk about the convention and what we thought of it. Last year's convention, I remember we came back and we were raving about it because of the experience of sort of experiencing a convention the way that they used to be. Not so much media hype, but more conversational and people wanting to legitimately buy comics and toys and things without huge prices and collectors swooping in and taking everything. How did you feel about this year's Comic Fest? Do you feel the same?
I do. I thought it was great, and I think that the the focus is intimate. The setting is supposed to be much more comfortable for folks who just really want to dig into the not just comic collecting, but discussions about the comic book genres and the different directions that that this particular field is going in, and it really does have that intimate appeal. Mm-hmm. And everyone is very approachable. There's this sense that we're all kind of on the same playing field as far as the creators and talent and the fans, and so there's this nice element about it that brings us together.
Yeah, and to sort of illustrate that element a little bit, we walked into our panel room. It was at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, and the very first thing that happened was a Batman fan walked in and instantly asked you if you had been playing Arkham Knight, and like it was instantly a conversational environment. There was no anxiety from folks whatsoever about, can I approach anyone or talk to anyone? It seemed like everyone there was just incredibly approachable, and you could just talk about anything and everything with anyone. It was fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about the panel that you had the opportunity to do where you guys tried the Winter Soldier.
We did try the Winter Soldier. Bucky, a.k.a. the Winter Soldier, Captain America's good friend, and unfortunately an agent for Hydra, had been put on the stand and was essentially tried for his war crimes. And it was a great experience. We had, of course, a prosecution side, a defense side, two expert witnesses on both sides, psychologists who spoke to his whether he would meet for legal insanity,
right,
and what his mental health condition may be in regards to having experienced this intense, invasive, somewhat ECT, electroconvulsive therapy type of intervention that he had, that was imposed on him by Hydra. So it was a great exercise, not just in terms of the psychological side and involvement, but also the legal side. What does constitute legal insanity? How is that different than a mental health condition? How does that impact, whether someone who's committed a crime will be charged for those crimes? So there was a real nice realistic element to something that, of course, is very built in fantasy.
Sure. And it was kind of cool seeing, they had a Winter Soldier there in costume. They had a Black Widow in costume there as the expert witness for the prosecution. And then, of course, they had two psychologists there to battle it out. And I thought it was really cool. It was especially cool to see a real federal sitting judge presiding over the trial. And then at the end, we got to see the jury deliberate. And they didn't get to deliberate for very long because this thing ran right up to the end of the 90 minutes. But all in all, I would say it was really cool. And I hear that they want to try to do this kind of thing again in the future and have you guys on board. So I think that would be awesome. So we hope you enjoyed hearing our live panel last week. If you haven't heard it, go and check it out. This week we are jumping into a brand new episode. But before we do that, we want to talk a little bit about a new social media platform that approached us about getting involved in their beta test. This platform is called IMZY. It is IMZY.com. And pretty soon they're going to open up and they're going to have it available for folks who want to try it out. But Drea, you've had an opportunity to try it out a little bit. This is a very community-based social media platform. And I realize that most social media platforms are supposed to be community-based. But what I think is really cool is the founders of this platform, they came from Reddit. And they weren't really all that fond of the way Reddit was run, particularly when it comes to the fact that the reputation Reddit has gotten is that of a very negative environment. It's sort of where trolls go to hang out.
Right. That's the type of site where trolls have essentially commandeered the community and really, taken it by its helm and steered it in a pretty negative direction.
Yeah.
If I can keep going with that metaphor.
Ship analogies,
yes,
go for it.
And it overturned. No, I'm kidding. But the great thing about IMZY is that the focus really is on maintaining and essentially welcoming, fostering this idea of having a healthy community, a place where folks feel like they can express their opinions in a safe way, that folks feel validated, that, there's no risk of the negativity and harassment that often will, seep into any kind of social media. So this, the good thing about IMZY is that there's this real deliberate direction towards sustaining that healthy aspect of it.
Yeah, they described it to us as all the things that they loved about Reddit when they first got involved, and that they are instantly monitoring to make sure that it remains a positive community. But what they've essentially given everyone, and they gave us the opportunity to create our own page, and it's not so dissimilar to, say, Facebook, where you've got a feed and all the different communities that you belong to are in a feed, and then you can go to those individual pages and you can participate on those pages. But then they're also giving us the opportunity to post direct links to our podcast so that you don't have to go to some other website. You don't have to go to iTunes to hear it. Or, they're also helping us out with potential giveaways for our listeners. So if you join MZ.com and you enjoy what you're seeing, then you could be selected at random to receive a giveaway from the Arkham Sessions. And some of the stuff that they've got going on is really cool. Right now, they are in a beta test phase, and it's just us communities sort of interacting with one another, feeling things out, trying to tell them what we like and what we don't like, how things can be changed. But they're about to open this up to the general public for an additional phase of the beta test for the next few months. So I highly recommend that you go over to imzy.com, that's imzy.com, and request an invitation to become a member so that you can check it out sort of from the ground level, and we can all work to make it as great a place as humanly possible. And that should happen within the next week or so, I was told. But you can go ahead and put your name and your email in now. And then we hope to see you there in a couple weeks.
Great. Let's talk about Batman.
Let's talk about Batman indeed. So, Drea, this week's episode is The Lion and the Unicorn. It focuses very heavily on Alfred. And we don't get too many opportunities to just really talk about Alfred and what he means to Batman and Robin. But this is a great opportunity to do it. And we even learn a little bit about his history pre-coming in and just being their butler. So we've always seen Alfred taking care of Bruce and Dick. He brings them their food, he does their laundry, he hangs their clothes, he does all kinds of different things.
He tells them to put on clothes.
He does tell them, he asks them to put on clothes.
Especially Dick.
Well, and how did you feel about that? Were you enjoying? We see him doing an acrobatic routine. He's clearly working out. He's only wearing his little gym shorts.
I think Alfred has a point. He might catch cold down there in the back cave.
In the dank back cave. And he's even delinting Batman's cape and cowl, which is kind of funny. Batman says that he doesn't think that the people that Batman will be interacting with tonight are going to care too much about a little lint. But it does show you that he's got that very parental attitude of, I need to look over everything and take care of you. And that's sort of how we know Alfred, and that's how they know Alfred.
What would we do without you, Alfred?
I shudder to think.
What would they do without Alfred? We find out because Alfred receives a phone call from his cousin, Frederick, who looks eerily like David Niven, and is told that they should meet at their usual location in London. So Alfred takes off without even telling Master Bruce or Master Dick. He does, however, leave them a letter.
Dear Master Bruce, my apologies for leaving so abruptly. I've just learned of a personal matter involving a cousin of mine that must be resolved immediately. I shall endeavor to return in a few days. Your obedient servant, Alfred. Must be pretty important. Alfred wouldn't leave a dirty dish unwashed if England were sinking into the sea.
I know.
So Batman knows a little something about Alfred that Dick doesn't, which is that Alfred wasn't always this manservant of the Wayne family.
Before he came to the States, Alfred did some work as an attaché in the British security services. More desk jobs than field work. But he acquired quite a reputation for diffusing diplomatically dangerous situations in high security areas.
And I always thought he was just a nice old guy who polished the silver and fixed me sandwiches.
So, Drea, what do you think about that? It sounds like Alfred, at least from Dick's perspective, is maybe just sort of taken for granted.
I wonder if Dick was being sarcastic with that comment because he's seen Alfred do so much more than just make tea and, do their laundry.
But he has always sort of been that level of, manservant where he will help out, but we've not seen Alfred do too much in the form of super heroic, sort of stuff. At least when Dick was there. Like sometimes we'll see Batman doing something and then Alfred will fly the Batwing over to save him. Although Alfred didn't do a very good job of flying the Batwing that day. So
since then we haven't seen him fly the Batwing, so he might have lost that privilege.
Yeah.
But I see what you're saying, that he's always been seen as their caregiver. He's always been seen as the person who watches over and cares for them. So the idea that he had this whole other life where he was very empowered and in charge of something pretty important, that could be very surprising to Dick.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Alfred, because it occurs to me that in the 70 some odd episodes we've never really focused on Alfred for any particular episode. And I feel like maybe that's a little bit of a disservice. We should probably give a little bit of a background to Alfred, because this isn't necessarily a new thing. This is, a lot of people understand that in Alfred's background, he was once a member of some sort of British intelligence or some sort of British military. In some cases, he was a doctor. In other cases, he wasn't, but he was in the field. And then in other cases, as we see here, he was more of a desk clerk, but he was in charge of a lot of very important information. And so let's talk a little bit about Alfred's origin. Drea, how far back would you say Alfred dates when it comes to Batman?
You mean in the
lore?
comics?
Yeah.
I know that in his first appearance, Batman worked alone. Alfred wasn't in the picture.
Right. Alfred didn't actually show up until Batman number 16. And that is a little shocking for some folks. What would be even more shocking is the fact that Alfred didn't look like the Alfred that we know today. In fact, in the same way that Batman the Animated Series introduced things that we now just accept as canon, the Batman serials of the 1940s were where we became familiar with Alfred as the thin figure with the even thinner mustache. I mean, that's where he became known. Up to that point, he was a bit of a portly fellow. But in Batman number 16, which a lot of people would recognize from the famous cover of Batman holding the cape over himself with Robin there in front of him, and the spotlight on them, and then
Yes.
the dark figure with the gun. It's actually been recreated many times since then, but it's always been an homage to Batman number 16. That is where Alfred is introduced in a short story simply called Here Comes Alfred. And in this story, Alfred comes off of a boat, and actually we find out that Alfred isn't even the Wayne's former butler. In fact, he is related to the Wayne's former butler. He is the son of Jarvis. Yeah, I know. Everybody's got a butler named Jarvis. But he is the son of Jarvis, who was the Wayne's prior butler. And it was sort of to fulfill the last wish of his dying father that he come back and continue the tradition of working for the Waynes. And that's where Alfred comes from. And actually, it's at that point that Batman and Robin decide to tell Alfred about their identities. Because if they don't, they've now got this person who doesn't know what they're doing, going all over the manor, and that could get awkward.
Right.
But that's the Alfred that started out in 1943 with Batman number 16.
And so over time, that character evolved, because initially it seems like he was a butler in the traditional way in terms of thinking about that as an occupation. But we know that he also has medical assistant skills. We also know that he is involved with some of the detective work that Batman does. And so he becomes much more kind of infused and becomes a part of the Bat family.
Yes, absolutely. It becomes far more essential to the goings on of the actual crime stopping in the Wayne family, and not just making them sandwiches. But let's talk a little bit about where they had initially seen this character when writing the writer's Bible for Batman the Animated Series. Now, we've done this a couple of times in the past where we've read the pages out of the writer's Bible. And the reason we do that, again, for those who don't remember, is this writer's Bible tells every writer who works on the show what kind of character this is. So it keeps those characters consistent from episode to episode to episode. So this is what they wrote. This was, of course, Eric Adamski and Paul Dini and Bruce Timm when they sat down and they wrote the writer's Bible. When talking about Alfred, other than Robin, Wayne Manor's trusted butler Alfred is the only person to know Bruce Wayne's secret identity. A longtime friend to Bruce's father, Alfred understands Wayne's grief and his desire to fight crime. Although concerned with Wayne's safety, he realizes that risks must be taken and considers himself part of Batman's operation. Alfred knows that his master is often uncomfortable with the boorish Bruce Wayne persona, and Alfred's wicked, dry wit is obvious in the easing of this tension through his orchestration of the Wayne charade. He controls Wayne's daily routine with utmost attention to detail, often going so far as to select Wayne's wardrobe and oversee his social calendar. A man of impeccable taste, Alfred might, for instance, select an array of truly tasteless ties and take great pleasure in outfitting Bruce Wayne with the gauche garments. Alfred's humor is priceless to the Batman, who sometimes admits his own tendency toward being too serious. Alfred often needles Batman about a hero's work never being done, and the obvious humor behind his beloved friend dressing up as a bat is not lost on Alfred. But without the jokes, Alfred is firmly committed to the Batman and his mission, and the men are deeply bonded by this shared goal. Alfred is equally efficient in maintaining the illusion of Batman and Bruce Wayne as different people. Always vigilant at Wayne Manor when the Batman is out on a case, he minds the phones and gates, making sure Wayne seems to be at home but unable to come to the phone. At other times, when Wayne is abroad, he craftily executes fake sightings of Batman to further deflect suspicion. So he's really, described as being crucial to maintaining the secret identity and the illusion that there are two different characters here. But it's also obvious that he enjoys maybe jabbing Bruce with some humor from time to time.
He's probably one of two persons in Bruce's life who can be that close, right? Who can kind of be bonded with him enough to pick on him and to point out the reality of what he's doing.
Right.
And I think it's good for us as viewers to also align with Alfred at times. Yes, this man is dressing up as a bat and fighting crime. Yes, he's oddly choosing crime over spending time with family. Like, we need Alfred at times to point out those idiosyncrasies about Bruce.
Let's talk about Alfred's loyalty to Bruce and to Dick, but specifically to Bruce. For a guy who's been there these many years, now to have the job is one thing, but he also feels this duty to Bruce's parents. And, let's talk about that man a little bit, because Alfred is probably one of those characters that you and I both agree no one can say is suffering from any kind of delusion or some sort of grandiose sense of self or any, this guy might be I'll say it, sanest characters in all of Gotham City.
Sure.
What do you think about Alfred Pennyworth, the man?
Well, two things. One, oftentimes a caregiver gets overlooked or isn't really the focus, especially when we're thinking about superheroes. A lot of our attention goes to Batman and Dick, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about the resiliency of someone like Alfred, he's pretty resilient. He's pretty strong and courageous on his end. While he isn't in the line of fire, he certainly encounters dangers. He encounters risks. He knows that he could lose either one of them or both of them in any given moment. So there is this sense of courageousness and this huge sense of strength on his end, emotionally and psychologically, to continue to be this support system.
Right.
I think a lot of times he holds the brunt of the psychological strength.
Right.
These guys come home and need to be cared for, need to be inspired, need to be, basically encouraged to continue to do what they're doing. So we always talk about Bruce's burnout, his own mental health, his own resiliency. And at times we need to realize that Alfred is a huge component of that.
Sure.
That he himself has a lot of strengths that we kind of overlook. The second thing is that Alfred represents an important role. And if we can kind of broaden the scope, that for anybody, a social support, a person who is strongly bonded to another person, whether it's a caregiver, a child, a family member, a close friend, that social support is a huge, huge resiliency factor in general. So what I mean by that is, if we're ever trying to predict whether someone will develop PTSD after a trauma, whether someone will develop clinical depression, whether someone's psychological reaction will be a certain way. Now, of course, there's a lot of biological and environmental context to take into account. But one of the best predictors of recovery is a person who provides social support.
Right.
So again, Alfred is a very important person.
Yeah, that's great. And it's obvious that he's missed when he disappears. Alfred calls Bruce from London, and Bruce kind of flips out. Oh my God, where are you? And then in other cases, they just don't really know what to do with themselves. So they go to London because Bruce overhears that Alfred is in trouble, and the Batwing must have a great gas tank in there to make this international flight
Direct.
As a jet. Yeah, direct. And they get there, break into some British Secret Service sort of location and get information as to where they could probably find Alfred and Frederick, who have been kidnapped by our old friend Red Claw, as played by Kate Mulgrew. Now, Red Claw doesn't realize Alfred has anything to do with Batman. So she doesn't understand why Batman knows that this is happening and happens to be in, just off the coast of Scotland, helping out this old man from Gotham City and trying to stop her from using the launch codes that Alfred and Frederick have to fire off a missile where she plans to hit London. And if she's not given just an ungodly amount of money, I think it was like £5 billion, which is
Wow.
a ton of money. At the time, I think
I was
maybe...
going to say, it was like 93, 94.
It seems like with that sort of request, she just wanted to blow up London. Like there was no chance they were going to be able to get the £5 billion to give her. So it's like, I'm going to create a number so high that they're going to have to fail, and I get to blow up London. But
That's your Kate Mulgrew?
no, that's my Red Claw. My Kate Mulgrew is entirely different. So Alfred, being this man with a dry wit, comes right out and tells her that he will not give her anything other than gibberish.
And people wonder why no one takes Britain seriously anymore.
Well, it turns out that some of this gibberish is actually his part of the code when he actually references the lion and the unicorn.
Well, I want to step in and ask, can you set this scene for us? Because how they're essentially being tortured.
Yeah, well, they're refusing to give up their halves of the code, and she decides that rather than torture them, what she's going to do is go the old route of using a truth serum.
Sooner or later, the serum always wins.
And we find that Frederick soon simply provides his part of the code.
Yes, very quickly provides his half.
So he breaks pretty easily.
Right.
Alfred appears to be resisting, but like you said, within the gibberish is that strange lion and unicorn code that actually is half of the code.
Right. So she uses his half of the code, the lion and the unicorn, in order to gain access to the missile. She launches the missile toward London, and Batman ends up saving the day with the Batwing. So after Batman blows up the missile headed for London, Alfred and his old friend Frederick, not his cousin, but his colleague, end up having this conversation where Frederick asks, wouldn't you rather be doing this again?
I've become accustomed to my style of living.
And not only has he become accustomed, but so has Bruce and Dick for sure.
Right. And, I mean, working as Batman and Robin's caretaker, I mean, that's a very exciting job.
Yeah. Trust me, he is not missing
Yeah.
the desk clerk work he used to do in London. He is doing some exciting stuff every single night at Gotham. In fact, this is probably the least amount of excitement he's had in quite some time. Now, I want to go back to the truth serum.
Yeah.
Because we've all heard or we've seen movies where they inject some serum into someone and they can't resist telling the truth. There's been talk that like sodium pentothal actually relaxes you to the state that you just can't resist telling the truth because, you just can't muster up the mental willpower to lie about anything. Drea, I know that this sort of thing has been used medically in the past. Psychiatrists have used stuff like this, but
right.
I want you to tell me a little bit about truth serums and if they have any basis in reality.
So the most common truth serum, you're right, is the sodium pentothal psychoactive drug. Mm-hmm. And that's often injected intravenously into the person. And there's sort of a misunderstanding about its effects, because in some cases, studies have shown that folks who are injected with it do reveal information. Mm-hmm. But it's difficult to really ascertain whether it's a truth serum per se. It's almost forcing somebody or lowering their inhibition so much that they can no longer resist and give away the information, or if in fact that the process of being injected with sodium pentothal is a torturous experience, in which case it falls under that really sort of muddy gray area of whether torture itself works.
Right.
So some folks say, and psychologists do say, that that sodium pentothal is a psychologically coercive interrogation technique, along with a whole bunch of other types of techniques, which we will talk about in a minute.
Okay.
But so what is sodium pentothal? It is a sedative. It's an anesthetic. You're right. It's used. It has been used medically, mm-hmm. and it is the first of 3 drugs that's injected for folks who get the death penalty.
Oh, right.
So
the lethal injection.
Yes.
Concoction, right?
Exactly. So we know that it depresses the central nervous system. It slows heart rate. It can knock you out. If you get enough of that, it'll mm-hmm. knock you out completely. Mm-hmm. So folks have realized that if you give someone just enough, it will lower their inhibitions. And in the same way that alcohol would have this effect, a person would have less control over what they say.
Okay.
But then one can argue, how different is this than shots of vodka, than alcohol, than other psychoactive substances that may actually have the same impact? So there's mixed perspectives about whether this is really a truth serum mm-hmm. or just another depressant that lowers inhibition.
Right. How reliable is that information in terms of, like, if you and I have discussed hypnotism here on the show before, and that it's controversial because you don't know if the information is real information or if it's just something that the imagination is processing, or if they're being coerced to say a certain thing, so they say a certain thing. I would imagine that something like this could be perceived as similar.
Right. And interestingly, many folks in my field, because we consider this injection, this type of interrogation, or this technique of interrogation, because we do consider it a torturous type of interaction mm-hmm. with someone who's detained, we would think about it in that way. In other words, how necessary is it to do that to somebody?
Right.
For one, are we violating human rights? And then on the other side of that coin, if you will, is the idea that we don't necessarily have enough evidence that it works. Sometimes it yields undesired results, and studies have shown that folks who are under the influence of sodium pentothal will actually confess to crimes or acts that they didn't do. Think about it like basic behaviorism. If I'm being injected with something, or if I'm being questioned or tortured, if there's any way that I am put into a position where I'm uncomfortable, where I'm experiencing pain, where I'm, detained, all those things. You take all those elements together and you realize if I simply admit to if I confess or give the information that someone is trying to get from me, then I'll do it and the pain will stop.
Right.
So now, this is going to lead us to some conversations around military programs, for instance, that I know you know a lot more about this than I do, that service members are actually taught how to resist interrogation, and that, some folks may be more, I don't know what the right word is, more susceptible, whereas other folks have actually gotten training in how to resist, right? So I'm certainly not talking about those folks who have training. I'm talking about some of the studies in which folks are, the risks might be lower, so they may be more apt to disclose information.
Right.
Having said that, this whole area, this whole discussion about torture naturally has to lead us to what's going on right now in the field of psychology, and what I would say is a pretty controversial, even a contentious issue within the field of psychology, as well as the role or the relationship between the military, the U.S. government, and psychologists. So I'll give you some more context for that.
Okay.
Way back after 9/11, let me go further. Before 9/11, as you're probably familiar with, there are many programs related to interrogation and related to developing techniques around interrogation. There were programs being created, and there were psychologists who were assisting in the development of those programs. So, and I should probably disclose, folks know that I've worked with service members in the military, active duty service members, as well as veterans. I've worked for the Veterans Hospital. I do not in any way have any relationship with the CIA or have never been a psychologist hired by the government. So I just have to make that clear that most of the information I know about this is available through the records that have been posted online or the articles and reviews. So when we go back to shortly after 9/11, of course, something major happens. This is during the Bush era. Psychologists are called to action, and the interrogation program is ramped up. So you've got Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib. So these facilities where these interrogation programs are essentially being developed and tested. And there are two psychologists in particular during this time who are basically spearheading these interrogation programs.
Okay.
So basically consultants for the CIA.
Sure.
And, working with the counterterrorist organization, creating these programs, training other folks to do it. And these are the psychologists who had did not invent, but ushered in the strategies like waterboarding.
Gotcha.
So, sleep deprivation, isolation, language isolation, all sorts of things that folks that, of course, the military knew about these things anyway. But these two psychologists, Dr. James Mitchell and Bruce Jensen, created this consulting company, and they had a lot of involvement with the development of the CIA's interrogation techniques. And what's happening now is psychologists are now realizing not just the involvement of the psychologists, but the intention behind what they were doing. Because if you think about these techniques, they're in complete violation of our psychology ethics code, which I know we've talked about on the show, right? So essentially do no harm, right? So psychologists are responsible to ensuring the safeguard and the welfare, dignities of the rights of others. And that would include detainees, right? So even though one may say like, well, the folks who are being tortured or interrogated are our enemy, psychologists are in a very, very tricky position.
They don't necessarily believe that the end justifies any means, particularly if those means go against the oath that you took and have to uphold, and your code of ethics.
I think that what fundamentally became problematic is the evidence that showed whether these techniques worked.
Right.
Because we know, for instance, that the evidence for any of these techniques they're on shaky ground. They're not necessarily, actually, there's some reports online you can look up that demonstrate that some of the early instances of using pentothal and waterboarding and some of these things, waterboarding especially, there's a lot of experimentation around waterboarding that found that the detainee doesn't necessarily disclose much more information than they did prior to the more severe, harsh technique.
Right.
So we have to think about whether those strategies are necessary.
Okay.
So it's not just, no, we certainly wouldn't do no harm, don't harm anyone for any reason. It's the rationale for why you would use such invasive techniques.
Okay.
So currently, this has really divided the field for many of the reasons. We can't cover all of them here on the show, but one of the reasons that you just brought up is a huge rationale for maybe why should this matter? We are trying to save hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
If we harm one or two people, wouldn't that be justifiable?
Right.
So the folks in the field of psychology have been sort of trying to manage and deal with those types of assertions, and trying to communicate that our code of ethics is to protect, to do no harm, and to minimize harm, right? So something like these harsh interrogation techniques would not fall within actions that we would be not just knowledgeable of. I mean, here's the part that's crazy, is that many in the psychological field were knowledgeable of these two guys and other psychologists who were involved with the post 9/11 interrogation program, but were involved. And the idea that psychologists would not only support and sometimes act as the person doing the interrogation for some of these mock experiments, like some of these psychologists went in and did it themselves.
Right.
So there is just this nasty history in the last 15 years of this going on, with a lot of stuff revealed. And I want to read this quote that I discovered and found really interesting by Colonel Kleinman, who's an Air Force intelligence officer. And actually, while he doesn't excuse these two psychologists, he tries to help us understand why they did it. And he said, good persons in extreme circumstances can do horrific things. What does that remind you of?
Germany.
I was going to say Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, which reminds us of Germany. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
let me repeat.
No, I mean, you're right. And if I haven't revealed how I feel about these two psychologists, I'll read a quote. Dr. Mitchell, in referring to these strategies that I mentioned, the waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, isolation, etc., had said, these interrogations required a comparable level of fear and brutality to flying planes into buildings.
So an eye for an eye kind of thing.
An eye for an eye, and also the idea that in order to, and this is one of the psychologists who also acted as, who helped in the interrogation and also acted as a mock interrogator. He makes it clear that in order to enact the interrogation, you have to be able to somehow embody or take on that level of fear and brutality, which to me is very disheartening. It's disappointing to know that a group of psychologists were essentially supporting this and involved in this. So it's actually currently still a pretty controversial issue. And, as of a couple weeks ago, new articles were being published showing some new information and demonstrating the need actually for psychologists to revise our ethics codes. And the government is telling us, revise them broadly enough so that we can still access you for help. Like, we don't want a blanket statement that says, like, we can't involve you in any form of interrogation. But it's, as you can tell, it's a very, very, very tricky thing to do.
Sure.
Wasn't that interesting?
That is actually really interesting. You know what's crazy, Drea, is actually if we were doing this show in air date order instead of production order, we actually wouldn't be able to continue that conversation on future episodes because this was the series finale of Batman the Animated Series.
Oh.
This aired 85th out of 85 episodes. So it's interesting that this episode, which goes outside of Gotham and really focuses heavily on Alfred, was the last episode to air when the show originally aired. Now, it wasn't the last episode produced, of course.
Sure.
There's still several more episodes left to go. So it's not like it was produced with the intention of being the series finale. But coincidentally, this episode, The Lion and the Unicorn, was in fact the series finale. Dre, what did you think of this episode?
I thought it was great. Like you, I appreciated that we're focusing on Alfred. And just like how so many of these episodes are written, we initially think this is going to be about Batman, but it's actually about a close it's a close character. It's someone close to him, and we learn much more about that other character. So they did that really nicely here. And of course, Red Claw is the villain that comes into play, but it's not really about Red Claw.
No. It's really a great episode about the man who's probably the most loyal to Bruce Wayne to ever exist. Like, I don't think there's anyone that's ever going to be more loyal to Bruce, even Dick. I mean,
Yeah.
going forward, we're not allowed to discuss the types of things that Dick Grayson ends up going and doing, but like, it's easy to say that Alfred Pennyworth is the most loyal person to Bruce Wayne.
Yeah.
So I appreciate this episode a lot because we've not really gotten too many opportunities to dive in and really talk about Alfred. So I'm happy to have been able to do it here. The one thing that I think we should talk about at some point, and it won't be today, but we're going to have to use this as one of those metrics that we use where we discuss just how predictable Batman is, because Red Claw ends up getting into the Batwing because she knows Batman is going to call the Batwing. He's going to need that. And she actually rips his cowl off at one point. Now, it's unclear as to whether she actually sees him.
I don't think she does.
I don't think she does, but it's not really addressed. He ejects her out of the Batwing. But she knew that he was going to be needing that plane to stop the missile. So at some point, you and I are going to talk about the fact that even Red Claw, who's only faced him one other time in Gotham City, seems to know exactly how Batman works. So get your arguments ready for that one.
Okay, I will. I'll prepare.
Next week, we're going to come back with a brand new episode, and that is Showdown, which already sounds exciting. Drea, until then, why don't you tell the folks where they can find you online?
Best way to interact with me is on Twitter. My handle is @ArkhamAsylumDoc. My website is underthemaskonline.com.
And you can find me. I am at bward028. You can email us both. We are arkhamsessions@gmail.com. And of course, you can find us both on Twitter. We both man the Arkham Sessions account, and that is @Arkham Sessions. You should also follow our family over at fanboycomics.net, or you can follow them on Twitter. It is @fanboycomics. On Twitter, comics is spelled with an X. And as we mentioned earlier in the show, come find us on imzy.com. That's imzy.com, where you'll have a lot more interaction with us as our community grows, and we're very excited about that. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together, we are
The Arkham Sessions.
God save the Queen.